everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to do a little discussion around morality and moral issues. I mentioned a few videos back that I would make this video, so here I am. It's a little bit unlike most of my content in that I'm not arguing a specific point. It's more of a general discussion around a few different topics that have been on my mind and kind of my thoughts on those topics. So the bulk of the video is going to be focused on self-righteousness and moral imposition, but I'm also going to be talking about moral relativism as well as moral pluralism. I'm going to be borrowing heavily from these two texts. One is The Self-Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, which I highly recommend. And the other one is The True Believer, Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements by Eric Hoffer. Both great books. I'll be quoting from them throughout this video. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about political polarization in the United States, since it's kind of the biggest issue right now. Maybe a little bit about war and the law, and I'm also going to give some thoughts on utilitarianism and look at a specific essay from Peter Singer and just give a kind of a critique on that, but mostly asking questions because, I don't know, I'm not claiming to know anything here. Obviously, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on morality because it's kind of a big topic, but I am just kind of hoping that this could get a discussion going, maybe down in the comments, and I would just be really interested to hear what you guys have to say on these issues. And so to begin with, I guess I'll just give a kind of a brief overview of the purpose of morality and its use throughout history. Obviously, morality is something that is very important to pretty much everybody. It's a very controversial thing just to talk about because people have such passionate responses and beliefs when it comes to morality. Morality, of course, is what we define as wrong or right. It's a way of life for everybody. Pretty much everyone tries to align themselves with their moral values, and people have different moral values depending on who they are, which is why I'm going to talk a bit about objective morality, and I'm also going to talk about moral relativism. But when it comes to the evolutionary purpose of morality, it's actually to, keep groups cohesive. In order to have societies, you have to have a shared moral system. It's a very kind of binding code of conduct. If you break the moral rules of your tribe, you will get kicked out, and evolutionarily speaking, you wouldn't be able to hunt or be successful in agriculture or anything like that. You would just starve and die. When it comes to intertribal conflict and wars and whatnot, that's almost always based on moral views. Sometimes it's just someone is invading your territory and you have to fight back, but a lot of the times war is a moral fight between different competing ideologies. And then of course, morality also gives people meaning in life. It gives you a purpose in life. When you're acting in accordance to a moral belief, or if you're trying to convince others to join your moral belief, it kind of makes life feel a little bit less meaningless. And then, of course, outside of how it binds cultures together, it also, especially in Western countries, grants individual rights, liberty, freedom, all of that kind of thing, and is often used to reduce harm in individuals and groups. So when it comes to morality as a cultural aspect, there are two main forms. One is a sociocentric model, which puts the needs of groups above the needs of individuals, and morality is used to bind those groups together to be strong and cohesive. And the other one is the individual rights model, where it's mainly about protecting the liberty and freedom of individuals, which we see more in the West. To quote from The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt says, "Most societies have chosen the sociocentric answer, placing the needs of groups and institutions first and subordinating the needs of individuals. In contrast, the individualistic answer places individuals at the center and makes society a servant of the individual." And I wanted to bring this difference up at the beginning because it kind of ties into the political polarization that we see in the United States. If you're not from the United States and have not turned on the news ever, things are a little bit hectic here. There is a huge culture war going on. People are very polarized in their views. Extremists on the right and left seem to dominate the conversation everywhere. And people are tired of it. It's actually, it's very rare that I see something on the news that actually makes me feel happy. But I did see on the news that most Americans view political polarization to be the biggest threat to our country and our democracy at the current moment. And I was just like, thank God I'm not the only one. It's basically everyone, except for the extremists who are uncompromising. But I wanted to bring this up because the culture wars and political polarization are both rooted in moral differences. When it comes to understanding different moral foundations, Jonathan Haidt brings up, I think, 5 of them: harm and oppression, fairness, loyalty, sanctity, and authority. And most people's moral beliefs rely on some or all of these foundations. And when it comes to the sociocentric versus individualistic moralities, we see this played out in kind of the liberal and the libertarian social views and conservative social views. Social liberals tend to focus on the individual harm principle and look at what behaviors or practices affect the individual, whereas social conservatives are more concerned with groups and social structures such as the family or government. Though naturally, conservatives also do care about individual rights and harm and oppression and all of that, it just tends to skew more towards the left side than the right side, and the right side tends to care more about sanctity and authority more than the left. And something that I think is interesting that I just kind of wanted to bring up is that there have been a lot of studies showing that conservatives can understand liberal viewpoints more than liberals can understand conservative viewpoints, and this has been my experience in real life. I feel like a lot of people on the left have these really harsh stereotypes and judgments that are often not factual about the other side, whereas the other side, of course, has that about the left, especially the more extreme you go. But in general, conservatives tend to understand liberal values a little bit more than liberals can understand conservative values. And this is why I think it's so important to be open to discourse and discussion and really take the time to try to understand the other side, because it's the only way that we can make a society that works for everybody. But one of the stereotypes people on the left often have about people on the right is that they don't care about harm or, individual oppression. But I personally don't feel like that's the case. I think it just plays out in different ways. I think social liberals tend to care, about the individual and place the needs of the individual first, whereas people on the right care about order and structure in society. And even if you take it on issues like gay marriage or welfare and stuff like that, I think the main drive behind social conservatives when it comes to those topics isn't that they just hate people and want poor people and gay people to suffer. I think they view putting so much emphasis on individual rights and letting individuals do whatever they want, so long as it's not hurting anybody else. I think that they view that as degradation of a social structure, and that too much focus on the individual will get rid of all, social structure. It will degrade the family. It will eventually cause more harm to everybody because it will leave us all weak and vulnerable and defenseless. And this is why they're so concerned with things like family values and the family structure, because destroying, hierarchy as a whole and government as a whole and social structure as a whole could leave all of us vulnerable and prone to more harm than we would otherwise, particularly when it comes to threats from outside states. And of course, I'm pretty socially liberal. I just say do what you want as long as you're not hurting anybody. But I can also see the other side just as clearly, even if I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the points that people on the right make. And then when it comes to welfare also, of course, on the left, people are like, this is great because people shouldn't be poor and dying. But then on the right, you have to admit it has led to increased single motherhood. It does kind of proliferate the freeloader problem, in which people choose not to contribute to society because they don't have to. And to just ignore both sides of that coin because you're too kind of polarized in one group or the other, I feel like this does a lot more damage than good. Or when it comes to affirmative action, of course, the big topic. It's true that some people don't have privileges on the mass scale when it comes to education and so on, but also you have to admitting some people based on their race and limiting other people based on their race is kind of, it's a little bit racist, it's like pretty clearly racist, but it's also nuanced as well, and this is why people have been debating about affirmative action forever, it seems. But when people are so sanctimonious and self-righteous on one side that they ignore, complicating factors, this doesn't do anyone any good because we can't come together as a whole and understand it and work out the nuances to something that serves everybody. Instead, people just absolutely hate each other and loathe each other, and policies can get so ineffectual and polarized that just like horrendous things can happen because it's just one-sided. There has to be balance in a free society, in my opinion. But I think a big factor of why people don't want to understand the other side and people don't want to have these conversations is because people are really afraid that when you listen to someone and you actually try to understand their viewpoint and just instead of just attacking them or arguing against them, regardless of the valid points that they bring up, is because when you try to understand someone, you risk changing yourself. That is just a key element of understanding. If you actually listen to someone's arguments and engage with them with an open mind and an open heart or whatever, you run the risk of being convinced to their side. And sometimes, I think most of the time it's easier for compromise to happen if both people are being understanding. But sometimes you will realize that you're wrong and the other person is right, and that's just a part of being a human being. But a lot of people cannot accept when they're wrong. They just can't. They always have to be right, which I personally don't understand. I get it because like everybody else, I've been closed-minded, before in my life and self-righteous and so on. But in general, I don't understand the need that people have to always be right, because if you think about it, life would be so boring if you were right all the time. If you were right all the time, what is the point of arguing with anyone? What is the point of talking to anyone? What is the point of like watching a documentary on some like issue? Like there would be no point in it all because you would just be right all the time and your view would never change, and it's like you might as well just be dead at that point, in my opinion. Because if you can't grow and learn and change and admit when you're wrong and then like find new ways of doing things, like it's just neglecting change. And if you're not changing at all or growing at all as a person, I don't know. It's just not a life that I would like to live, and I don't necessarily understand the desire to always be right. But of course, being right does feel good, so I get it in that sense. I don't know. And then, like I mentioned excessively in my PC culture video, the other thing about political polarization is people think that limiting rights like free speech or separation of church and state will only help them, when that's not the case. If you limit free speech and make hate speech laws and do all these things that you think will only help your cause, no, it could easily be turned around against you. If the majority shifts and they decide to censor your speech and your thoughts and your beliefs and your actions, it's just going to hurt you. That's why things like the First Amendment have to be for everyone for them to work. It's like people who are against the separation of church and state and they just want America to be like a Christian nation. Okay, well, America could just as easily be a Muslim nation if you don't want separation of church and state. And most of the people who want it are Christians here. Imagine if it was another religion. Now immediately you're like, well, I guess that was a bad idea. That's why these rights have to be for everyone for them to work. And so with that being said, I'm going to move on to moral relativism and some thoughts I have on this belief, because I personally am not a moral relativist or a cultural relativist or anything like that. My main criticism with moral relativism and cultural relativism is just how nihilistic it is, because if you really think all moralities and all cultures are created equal and that it's wrong to impose on somebody else's morality because you never know what's wrong or right, I think this is a mistake, and I think it's really nihilistic, because if that's the case, then literally nothing matters. If you could let another country have a Holocaust because that's just their moral belief, and you're like, well, I can't transgress on their moral belief because morality is relative, like, I don't know, whenever I think about that, I go down the whole rabbit hole of like, life is so pointless and meaningless, and I'm sure it probably is, I'm personally of the belief that you create your own meaning in life, but I just think that viewing morality as, relative does a lot more harm than good. You literally will allow evil to exist in the world just because you think that they have a different point of view. And I get not wanting to like start an unjust war or, being wrong. Like imagine being like a religious like conqueror, and you like conquer an entire nation, kill a bunch of people, force them to convert to your religion, and then you look around at like the mangled bodies in front of you, and then you realize like, actually, I don't really believe in this religion. Like, I think I might have been wrong. Like, that would be horrible. But the idea that all morals are equally valid, I just think that's absolutely ridiculous. Please let me know down below what you think on that, because I know a lot of people do think that there is no objective morality, and I think that's really interesting, and I would love to hear what you have to say on it and your views on moral relativism. And something I feel like is the case a lot for people who are cultural or moral relativists is that if you just ask them a couple of questions, they immediately backtrack. Like, if they're like, oh, everyone's culture is just based on their own norms and we can't really judge other cultures or other morals because like it's just wrong to judge people. It's like, okay, but like, what if someone's culture has like marry your rapist laws, where if you're raped, you have to marry the person who raped you, or you get stoned to death if you're gay, or female genital mutilation? Like, you think these are just cultural norms that should be allowed to exist when they're just absolutely harming people and are like really fucked up? Like, I don't know, but it's like, I also understand that people don't want to be too self-righteous and too closed-minded in their own morals, which is why I'm going to be talking about that next. And then when it comes to objective morality, I'm going to talk about this more when I get to moral pluralism, so just stay tuned. But then the last thing I wanted to say about moral relativism as well is that it almost seems meaningless, because you could just say that your moral belief is that you can impose your morality on other people, and then in that case, moral relativism really means nothing. It doesn't seem like viewing morals as relative in that sense changes anything, because you could still view your morals as being the ultimate ones and be justified in attacking other people based on their moral beliefs or imposing your way of life on other people, because you can just chalk it up to your own morality, and also it would grant you access to do the most atrocious war crimes or whatever in the face of your own morality, which is just complicated. And so now for this part of the video, I want to talk about self-righteousness, because that was kind of the jumping off point for creating this video. I mentioned in my ex-vegan video about how confusing it can be when you believe in something so strongly as a moral foundation, and then your views change over time, and then you kind of think back about all the aggressive and unsavory behaviors and beliefs you took part in the ways that you maybe treated others in the sake of your moral beliefs, and just coming to terms with that, and just coming to terms with your own self-righteousness and your own self-righteous behavior. And if you haven't seen that video, or if you came from that video and you're mad at me because of that video, again, like I stated all throughout that video, I have nothing against veganism. I just don't think it's that black and white. I don't think it's fully immoral in all circumstances to eat animals. But this video is not about veganism, but I did want to jump into the self-righteousness aspect of morality, because it's very easy to have a moral belief and then cross over into self-righteousness, aggression, violence in the sake or in the name of that moral belief. We see this all the time when it comes to religious wars and so on. And the main question I had in my ex-vegan video was, how do we justify imposing our morals on other people when we know that morals can change over time, and we also all know that we're wrong sometimes? If you have enough self-awareness, you know that you're wrong sometimes, like everybody is. And so if we're wrong sometimes, like, how can we justify, and what behaviors can we justify enforcing our beliefs on other people? It's like a kind of a complicated question that I don't know if there's a specific answer to, but I think there are some ways to kind of question and figure out whether or not your beliefs are self-righteous or not, particularly if you view your belief as the one and only truth, as the cure to everything, to the cure to all malady or whatever. In a lot of circumstances, if not most, moral self-righteousness often comes from a hatred of the self or a denial of the self, and the need to kind of purge yourself of all wrongdoing and evil and just fully believe some other ideology and give everything to it in order to mask your own deficiencies or in order to give you a purpose in life when you otherwise feel like life is meaningless. But of course, when an ideology is presented as the one and only truth, this leads to fundamentalism, it leads to closed-mindedness, oftentimes leads to violence. And when it comes, for instance, to the cancel culture people, which of course I talk about all the time on my channel, this is a huge motivation, I think, for that. People who feel guilty about who they are or can't accept the bad parts of who they are, instead spend their whole lives trying to cancel other people or try to pick apart and nitpick other people's transgressions, because that's easier for them than doing that to themselves. And then Eric Hoffer states in this book, "When we lose our individual independence in the corporateness of a mass movement, we find a new freedom. Freedom to hate, bully, lie, torture, murder, and betray without shame and remorse." And when it comes to being in a group, you don't have to deal with yourself. You're part of a greater whole. You don't feel responsible for your actions necessarily because they're in purpose of something greater than yourself. And you're not really held, at least in your own belief, to the same standard as an individual who is not a part of your group would be. And then another aspect of self-righteousness that is really worrisome to me is just the emotional reasoning people do to justify their moral beliefs. I talk about this in my extended adolescence video, the recent stigmatization of age gap relationships and just using your own disgust towards something as a means to believe that it's immoral. Same with gay relationships, as I talk about in that video. People see two men kissing or think about two men having sex or something and they think that's disgusting and they feel disgusted, and then they assume that those feelings of disgust mean that that other person's actions are immoral, when that is not necessarily the case. In my opinion, that's not the case when it comes to gay relationships or age gap relationships, but it's something that people do all the time. And another quote that I wanted to read from Jonathan Haidt is, "I can't call for the community to punish you simply because I don't like what you're doing. I have to point to something outside of my own preferences, and that pointing is our moral reasoning. We do moral reasoning not to reconstruct the actual reasons why we ourselves came to a judgment. We reason to find the best possible reasons why somebody else ought to join us in our judgment." And this is something I feel like anyone who grew up or has lived in a small town has dealt with, particularly religious communities, where any behavior outside the norm is punished and gossiped about and looked down upon, and people aren't necessarily trying to think critically about whether that person's behavior is morally correct or not. They're just trying to convince everyone else that it's wrong based on their own either insecurity or disgust. And Jonathan Haidt argues that this is kind of the evolutionary purpose of moral reasoning. It's not to convince ourselves of something, it's to convince other people and have them join us, because like he says, cohesive groups need singular, or in some cases kind of multifaceted, but some level of shared morality in order to thrive. And now that I think about it too, and I know a lot of people have had the same feeling, when it comes to people who are so offended by every single thing, a lot of the times you're like, are they actually offended, or are they just trying to convince other people to be offended and trying to convince themselves to be offended? Because it seems like that a lot. There are so many things that it's like no reasonable person, or even an unreasonable person, would be offended by this. Like, this is so minor and stupid, but people make a huge fuss about it, and it almost seems like they're trying to convince other people in order to convince themselves, because no reasonable person would be convinced of that themselves. But the other big aspect of self-righteousness is that it just feels good. Morally righteous anger feels good. It feels good to be against something. It feels good to be attacking something. It feels good to be upset about something in certain circumstances. And again, I think a big aspect of this is that it's taking, if you spend all your time just hating yourself and being guilty over yourself and like talking to yourself, and then you see someone else doing something wrong and you get to, direct all your anger towards them, that feels really good, because finally you're not just focused on yourself, you're focused on the faults in somebody else, which is probably a very unhealthy way of viewing things, but as humans, a lot of the times we fall into this. And this is also why I think the most insecure people are the ones who are most outraged all the time. But then when it comes to the group aspect of self-righteousness and morality, and mass movements in general, I want to read a quote from Eric Hoffer that I just really like about the Nazi movement and about escaping individual responsibility through the corporateness of a mass movement. He states, "We join a mass movement to escape individual responsibility, or, in the words of the ardent young Nazi, to be free from freedom. It was not sheer hypocrisy when the rank-and-file Nazis declared themselves not guilty of all the enormities they had committed. They considered themselves cheated and maligned when made to shoulder responsibility for obeying orders. Had they not joined the Nazi movement in order to be free from responsibility?" And I just think this is a great point to bring up because I think this is the driving force for a lot of people to join cults, ideologies, mass movements, all this kind of thing, is to neglect their own individual responsibility and choice in things. And it makes sense that people in these horrific crimes feel like, they were just following orders and they shouldn't have to shoulder the responsibility, when of course they should, because you can't escape personal responsibility, sorry. But with that being said, I want to jump into the concept of moral pluralism, which is something that took me kind of a while to wrap my head around, but it's basically the arguing point of the righteous mind. He states at the beginning of the book, "When I was a teenager, I wished for world peace, but now I yearn for a world in which competing ideologies are kept in balance, systems of accountability keeps us all from getting away with too much, and fewer people believe that righteous ends justify violent means." And he also talks about creating a nation with different groups of competing ideologies and beliefs and cultural norms and so on was seen by the founding fathers of America as a way to protect against tyranny, which makes sense because a group where everyone believes the same things or is super PC and there's only certain things you could believe, that group is very susceptible to being overturned into some kind of nationalist or social movement that will kind of oppress everybody, like communism or the Nazi movement and so on. And this is why, of course, we have a Bill of Rights. It's not to protect the majority because a democracy already does that. It's to protect individual liberties even when the majority is against them. And then Jonathan Haidt also warns to be aware of anyone who insists that there is one true morality for all people, times, and places, particularly if that morality is founded upon a single moral foundation. And then he describes moral pluralism, which is basically the view that different moralities can exist within a society, but they naturally all have to be held to some sort of standard because it's not the same thing as moral relativism, where you can just be like, oh, your morality involves having a Holocaust, okay, I guess I can't do anything about that. Like, it's still held to some kind of norm. And what I could gather from the book, he kind of explains that norm as being able to understand that person's point of view and see where they're coming from, and being able to be like, okay, this morality makes sense even if I don't agree with it, and it's not an egregious, overreaching morality, and therefore I'll let it exist. And when I read this, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, how can you be a moral pluralist? Because when it comes to morality, if you view that morality as objective, you're still holding these other moralities to your standard. You're saying this one's a little bit immoral, but it's not too immoral compared to my own standard, so I'll let it exist. And it didn't really make sense to me, but when you compare it to self-righteousness and all that entails, and then like I said about never knowing whether or not you're right and wrong, it kind of does make sense. And like he said, when it comes to tyrannical nations, like the more diversity, especially diversity of thought, which unfortunately seems to be eroding in our country right now, is really important, not only for group success because we're able to solve problems more efficiently when we're open to other perspectives, but it also just makes a better world to live in because we could be like, oh, you think drinking alcohol is against your moral beliefs or your religious beliefs? Okay, well, you don't have to drink alcohol, but you don't get to ban it for everybody else because not everybody shares in that. And that's a pretty, benign moral belief, it seems. Whereas other moral beliefs, again, like murdering people for no reason and thinking it's morally justified because you just felt like it, might not be accepted in a morally pluralistic society. But of course, this topic is kind of complicated. I feel like there's a few holes in the argument, though overall it sounds like the right thing to do, and it sounds like what I would want to align with personally. But I could see how other people would think there is no middle ground when it comes to morality, in which case self-righteousness is a big issue. So please let me know what you think about this down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. And then a few thoughts when it comes to war and when it comes to law. Obviously, most wars are based in moral grounds and moral beliefs. I think a big argument for moral pluralism, like I stated earlier, is that without it, if we just allow one group to be fully correct in their views and everyone else to be wrong here in the United States, I feel like that's going to make polarization so much worse to where there's just two camps that everyone's segregated into, and it's just going to cause literally another civil war. Because when there's no compromise, that's what happens. And I feel like someone's going to take that out of context and be like, oh, so you're saying slavery should have been compromised? No, that's not what I'm saying. Sometimes a civil war is justified. But when it comes to the polarization in the United States, I feel like this would be a really stupid thing to have a war over. I feel like there is a way that we can kind of make things work for everybody without just turning to violence, particularly because if we do get into a civil war from the political polarization, people will just have to pick sides in terms of which camp to be in, of who they agree with more, because if you're not an extreme leftist or an extreme rightist, there are probably things on the left that you think are ridiculous and should be criticized, and other things on the left that you agree with. And there's probably things on the right that you think are ridiculous and should be criticized, and other things on the right that you agree with. And of course, most people lean to one side or the other, but when it comes to extremes, they literally just have to pick the lesser of two evils and kind of neglect all of the actual things they believe from the other side. And I just feel like, oh God, that would just be so messy. I'm just not down, that's all. I'm not down. But when it comes to more, I guess, universal principles, when it comes to morality, we do have things like war crimes. Like, there are things that are outlawed for everyone to engage in when it comes to war crimes. Obviously, if you're a powerful country, this really doesn't apply to you. A lot of countries treat the Geneva Convention like a bucket list and not like code of conduct. But the fact of the matter is, there are certain moralities that kind of exist for everybody regarding things even as dark and sometimes necessary as war. And I know everyone loves to be anti-war and just be like, all war is wrong, all violence is wrong. But personally, I do feel like war is sometimes justified. The just war theory on Wikipedia is defined as: the just war theory postulates the belief that war, while it is terrible, but less so with the right conduct, is not always the worst option. Important responsibilities, undesirable outcomes, or preventable atrocities may justify war. And naturally, I agree with this. I think, if every other option has been exhausted and war is the last option to prevent something like a Holocaust or concentration camp, or someone else trying to enforce that way of life on everybody else, sometimes it is justified. But I also, again, as stated earlier, a lot of wars are born out of self-righteousness and unnecessary moral imposition and trying to change ways of life in other countries that aren't even necessarily worse than the way of life in your own country. And it's just a very messy topic. And then when it comes to the law, like I said earlier, separation of church and state, First Amendment, this is really important. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about morality and free will, not in depth, obviously, but when it comes to the insanity defense in law, or provocation or diminished capacity and these other kind of definitions of conduct when a criminal is on trial, this obviously relates to free will, because an insanity defense basically states that this person should be held to a lower moral standard because they were acting outside of their free will when they murdered someone or raped someone or whatever it is that they're on trial from. And I think this is controversial for a lot of reasons. Obviously, can you hold people to different moral standards based on capability? If someone has diminished capacity because they're intoxicated and then they stab someone and they claim, I wasn't fully in control of what I was doing because I was intoxicated, should they have a lesser punishment? Again, it's very controversial, especially the insanity defense thing. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts down below. But that also just highlights how important it is to talk about free will and being a free agent in regards to morality. Because also, if there's no free will, how can we ever morally judge anybody? But I don't know. I'm not an expert on this topic, obviously, so please let me know your thoughts down below. And then in this last little part of my video, I wanted to talk a bit about utilitarianism, some of my questions around it, and I'm going to be talking about the Peter Singer article, The Singer Solution to World Poverty, because I just remember reading this in high school in one of my classes and everybody got so mad. So I'd be interested to hear what you guys have to think, and just some critiques or questions I have around utilitarianism, because I don't think it's the one size fits all approach to human life and morality personally, because I do see some practical obstacles to this train of thought. And utilitarianism, if you don't know, is basically the belief that we should strive as human beings to create the most pleasure possible for the greatest amount of people and reduce as much suffering as possible, which sounds good. I mean, they view that the pursuit of pleasure and the feeling of pleasure to be the meaning of life and the most important virtue. But when put into practice, this is a lot more complicated. In the Peter Singer essay, he states that because it only takes a certain amount of money to save a dying child in Africa, for instance, or save someone from malaria or some kind of treatable illness, because that only takes around $200 in his estimation, that any money you make above covering your basic needs needs to be donated to orphanages and charities and so on to help those people. And he thinks that dining out or buying clothing that isn't necessary and so on is morally reprehensible, because that money could be going to increasing the pleasure of other people who would otherwise be suffering. He states in the article that if you make $50,000 a year, you should donate $20,000 of that to charity. If you make $100,000 a year, you should donate $70,000 of that to charity, and so on. And so naturally, this brings up a lot of questions. Number one, if you're not dining out, if you're not buying things, if you're not, contributing economically to your own society and all your money is going to, the third world or whatever it is he wants you to donate your money to, then how are those people in our society going to have jobs? How are they going to have well-being and livelihoods? If you're an artist and craft maker and now you can't make your crafts because no one's buying your shit because they're all giving their money elsewhere, what about your pleasure? What about your way of life? What about your economic stability? And then also when it comes to the utilitarian argument, how much of your own suffering then should be endured for the pleasure of others? If you sacrifice your entire life and are miserable all the time, but it makes 5 people happy versus one person, which is yourself, and it's morally wrong to put yourself above those 5 people, well, what is the point of being alive then if you're just suffering? And then of course there's also the problem that you really can't measure pleasure. I'm sure there are some ways to measure brain waves or something, or see how much dopamine someone releases, but in general, you can't be okay, if you do this certain thing and you suffer this much for it, well, statistically that's a smaller number than the amount of pleasure for these other things. It's really difficult to measure, and I don't know, it seems a little bit inhuman in my opinion. And then of course, as most people state, it also is totally impractical. People aren't going to do that, and Peter Singer mentions that in his essay. He says, yeah, people don't do this, but you're morally wrong if you don't. So I don't know. But then of course the other argument that this brings up is, if you make $100,000 being a surgeon, or you can make $40,000 being a clerk, but after you give to charity, you both have the same $30,000, what is the incentive to be a surgeon? Because that's an extremely stressful, time-consuming job that you have to go through all this education for. What would be the incentive if you don't get a better life from that job? And this, of course, is something that naturally gets brought up around discussions around communism, because a lot of people, it seems nowadays, are identifying more and more with being communists, which first of all, already under communism, you don't get to decide what you do with your labor. It's the state tells you. You don't get to be oh, I want to be a surgeon or a baker. They're no, you have young, healthy body. You go build house now until you're disabled, and then I find something else for you. That's what it is. I'm sorry, that's a really bad accent, but basically, again, that's something that this argument brings up. Then what is the incentive to take on a job that's a lot riskier than a job that might be less risky, particularly if you have children to take care of? And then again, like I said, most people aren't going to endure suffering for the betterment of others unless they feel directly responsible. For instance, children. If you have children, most people who are good parents will put the needs of their child before their own because they chose to have a child and that child is dependent on you. And I get it that most people are altruistic sometimes. People do things just for the sake of being good and for helping people. That's a normal thing. But my question when it comes to utilitarianism, and particularly this argument, is how much suffering should the individual take in order to better the lives of other people? And to that, let me know down below. Again, like I said, I have a feeling this video might make people angry just because it's such a prevalent and important topic, and I'm not an expert at all on any of it. I just kind of wanted to share some of my thoughts on it because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and in the shower. And the only way to get it out of my head, honestly, is to make a video about it. And so that's what I'm doing. But I'd be curious to know your beliefs. How do you judge morality? Are you a moral relativist? Have you ever been self-righteous in your past? If so, how did you overcome it? Do you think moral pluralism is realistic? Do you think it is a goal? Do you think it works? I'd be very curious to know. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, it means a lot to me. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already and you're interested in this kind of content, though normally I am making more social commentary type argumentative essays rather than just rambling. But here I am today rambling, so sometimes this happens. Anyways, give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and if you are subscribed to me, then I will see you guys in the next time I upload. So thank you.